on World News Tonight. Final goodbyes. Thousands clamour as Her Majesty the Queen leaves Westminster for the last time. Historic gathering. London becomes the most protected city on earth as 85 world leaders gather for the late monarch's final rites. Paying tribute. Royal family members reminisce the warmth of Her late Majesty with their solemn yet emotional remembrance. Mourning Her Majesty. Britons stand in silent goodbye, bidding farewell to their beloved monarch.
This is Derana World News Tonight. Reporting from Colombo, here is Suzanne Shanali.
A very good evening and thank you for joining us on World News Tonight. After days of lying in state, the body of the late Queen Elizabeth II began her final journey as part of a grand state funeral, first to Westminster Abbey for a religious service in front of a congregation of thousands, and then to Windsor Castle for a more intimate committal service, and finally a private burial. It's been a day of emotion, pomp and ceremony, the like of which has not been seen since the last state funeral of Winston Churchill almost 60 years ago. The Buckingham Palace had said that the Queen made personal additions to the plans. The Queen's lying in state of Westminster Hall in the heart of London came to an end in the early hours of today. A short distance away at Westminster Abbey, the doors opened for guests to start arriving ahead of the funeral service. Heads of state from across the world joined members of the royal family to remember the Queen's life and service. Senior UK politicians and former prime ministers were also in attendance. Members of royal families from across Europe, many of whom were blood relatives of the Queen, were present as well. Belgium's King Philip and Queen Matilda and Spain's King Felipe and Queen Letizia have already been situated for the ceremonies. At this moment, the ceremonial part of the day began in earnest as the Queen's coffin was lifted from the catafalque where it was been resting and taken to Westminster Abbey for her funeral service. Her late Majesty was carried on the state gun carriage of the Royal Navy, drawn by 142 sailors. The carriage was last seen in 1979 for the funeral of Prince Philip's uncle, Lord Mountbatten, and was used for the Queen's father, George VI, in 1952. Senior members of the royal family, including the new king and his sons Prince William and Prince Harry, solemnly followed the gun carriage in procession. The pipes and drums of the Scottish and Irish regiments led the ceremony, along with members of the Royal Air Force and Gurkhas. The route was lined by the Royal Navy and Royal Marines, and a guard of honour stood in Parliament Square, made up for all three military services, accompanied by a Royal Marines band. The Queen's funeral service at Westminster Abbey was attended by approximately 2,000 guests. Being a state funeral, an event of such nature is typically reserved for kings and queens, which follow strict rules of protocol, such as a military procession and the lying in state. The Abbey hosting the funeral service is the historic church where Britain's kings and queens crowned, including the Queen's own coronation in 1953. It was also where the then Princess Elizabeth married Prince Philip in 1947. There hasn't been a monarch's funeral service in the Abbey since 18th century, although the funeral of the Queen Mother was held there in 2002. The service was conducted by the Dean of Westminster, David Hoyle, with the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, giving the sermon. Prime Minister Liz Truss read a lesson. Towards the end of the funeral service, the last pause, a short bugle call, was played, following by a 2-minute national silence. The national anthem and a lament playing by the Queen's piper brought the service to an end. The procession, led by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, was made up of 7 groups, each with its own band. Members of the armed services from the UK and the Commonwealth, the police and the NHS were also involved. Once again, the King led members of the royal family walking behind the gun carriage bearing the Queen's coffin. Camilla, the Queen Consort, the Princess of Wales, the Countess of Wessex and the Duchess of Sussex joined the procession in cars. Once at Wellington Arch, the coffin was transferred to the new state hearse for its final journey to Windsor Castle. The castle continuously inhabited by 40 monarchs across almost 1,000 years and had special significance to the Queen throughout her life. As a teenager, she was sent to the castle during the war years as London faced the threat of bombing, and more recently she made it her permanent home during the coronavirus pandemic. The hearse arrived for a walking procession by Windsor Castle's Long Walk. The 5-kilometre avenue will be lined with members of the armed forces. Members of the public were allowed access to the Long Walk to watch the procession pass. The King and senior members of the royal family joined the cortege in the quadrangle in Windsor Castle a little later. The castle's Sebastopol and curfew tower bells were tolled every minute and gun salutes were fired from the castle grounds. Then the coffin entered St. George's Chapel for a committal service. St. George's Chapel is the church regularly chosen by the royal family for weddings, christenings and funerals. It is where the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, Prince Harry and Meghan, were married in 2018 and where the Queen's late husband Prince Philip's funeral was held. Attended by a smaller, more professional congregation of about 800 guests, the committal service was conducted by Dean of Windsor David Connor with a blessing from Archbishop of Canterbury Justin Welby. The service included traditions symbolizing the end of the Queen's reign. The imperial state crown and the sovereign's orb and scepter were removed from the top of the coffin by the crown jeweler, separating the Queen from her crown for the final time. At the end of the last hymn, the King placed the Queen's company camp colour or flag of the Grenadier Guards on the coffin. The Grenadier Guards are the most senior of the foot guards carrying out ceremonial duties for the monarch. At the same time, the Lord Chamberlain, former MI5 Chief Baron Parker, broke his wand of office and placed it on the coffin. The snapping of the white staff will signal the end of his service of the sovereign as a most senior official in the royal household. The Queen was then lowered into the royal vault and the sovereign's piper played before a blessing and the singing of God Save the King. The performance by the piper at Windsor was something the Queen had personally requested. Later, on at a private family service, the Queen will be buried together with her late husband, the Duke of Edinburgh, at the King George VI Memorial Chapel located inside St. George's Chapel. Her marble slab will be engraved Elizabeth II 1926 to 2022. King Charles met leaders of the Commonwealth and the realm at Buckingham Palace ahead of the late Queen's state funeral that is likely to be one of the biggest ceremonial events ever held in Britain. The monarch separately held talks with the Prime Ministers of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the Bahamas and Jamaica. Sri Lankan President Ranil Wickremesinghe and First Lady Maitri Wickremesinghe also paid their last respects to the late Queen. Leaders such as Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau gave their deepest condolences, and leaders reminisced on the lengthy history between him and Her late Majesty, stating that he will always miss her presence when he visits the United Kingdom. Commonwealth leaders gathered at London's Lancaster House to sign an official book of condolence for the late Queen Elizabeth II. Leaders of nations of all parts of the globe signed the book. Mourners and security gathered in central London hours ahead of the start of Queen Elizabeth II's funeral. However, the crowds have not dispersed as of yet, and streets are still very much packed with people clambering to say their final goodbyes long after the procession was concluded. Hours ago, thousands of unlucky Britons were turned away at the queues for paying respects to the late Queen as the duration for lying in state had concluded. Despite this, many continued to shuffle along single file to catch even the slightest glimpse. Transport chiefs said well over 1 million people were expected in central London for the funeral, while police say it's the biggest security operation ever in this capital. World leaders, dignitaries, politicians, public figures and European royals were amongst the 2,000 attendees. US President Biden also paid his final respects to the Queen.
U.S. President Joe Biden paid an emotional tribute to Queen Elizabeth on the eve of her state funeral, saying Britain and the world had been lucky to have such a dignified and dedicated public servant on the throne for 70 years.
So to all the people of England, all the people of the United Kingdom, our hearts go out to you, and you were fortunate to have had her for 70 years. We all were. The world's better for her.
Biden was among the scores of international dignitaries and royals who have arrived in London for Monday's funeral. He followed other world leaders in appearing on a balcony overlooking the Queen's coffin in historic Westminster Hall, making a sign of the cross and placing his hand on his heart in reverence. Biden also attended an evening reception with King Charles, along with French President Emmanuel Macron, British Prime Minister Liz Truss, Israeli President Isaac Herzog, and Dubai's ruler Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, among many other world leaders.
Camilla, wife of King Charles and now Queen Consort, said the smile of the late Queen Elizabeth was unforgettable in a message of tribute to the late monarch.
She has been part of our lives forever. I'm 75 now, and I can't remember anybody except the Queen being there. It must have been so difficult for her being a solitary woman. There weren't women prime ministers or women presidents. She was the only one, so I think she carved her own role. She made a rule that she had her private time and her private passions and then her public role, and I think that is very important that, you know, the diary is planned out so you know when you're on duty and when you've got to do things. And then when she went up to Scotland in August, you know, that was the moment where it was her enjoyment. She's got those wonderful blue eyes that when she smiles, you know, they light up her whole face. I'll always remember that smile. You know, that smile is unforgettable.
Let's go into a short commercial break. We'll be back soon with more world news. Welcome back. The Queen's 6 grandchildren made history as they stood in vigil around Her Majesty's coffin for the first time in the United Kingdom's royal history. The solemn tribute was one that moved many of the nation's people.
The 8 grandchildren of Queen Elizabeth II, led by Prince William and his brother Harry, stood in silence for a 15-minute vigil surrounding the remains of the former monarch lying in state in the historic Westminster Hall. William, who is now the heir to the throne, stood at the head of the flag-draped coffin as mourners filed quietly past. Some bowed and made the sign of the cross. Outside, King Charles III and his son, the Prince of Wales, made an unannounced visit to a long row of people. They shook hands and greeted well-wishers in the kilometres-long queue near London's Lambeth Bridge. The line accessing the interior of the burning chapel exceeds 24 hours of waiting. Earlier on Saturday, authorities warned it was about to reach capacity, while London police say Monday's funeral will be the biggest security operation it has ever undertaken.
A moment of silence marked Britain's respect for their late monarch. The Big Ben stopped its ring as well as citizens lowered their heads in remembrance of the late Queen.
Even Big Ben stood silent. The United Kingdom held a minute's silence at 8 o'clock on Sunday night to pay tribute to the late Queen Elizabeth II ahead of today's state funeral. Leaders and heads of state across the world will gather in London to attend, including French President Emmanuel Macron, Spain's former King Juan Carlos I, and US President Joe Biden. Around 500 dignitaries are expected to attend the service in Westminster Abbey. Mourners queued patiently on Sunday, some of them for over 14 hours, to pay their respects to the monarch whose reign lasted more than 7 decades.
The people who are in the queue behind us, we just all hugged when we came out. So the whole episode, from it's so well organised, all the security guards and everyone are just so friendly.
It's going to be quite emotional, but yeah, I thought it was important to come and pay the respects after 70 years of service.
Thousands defied warnings from authorities urging people to stop joining the queue for the Queen's lying in state. And despite a desperate final dash to join the queue, some were left unable to say their goodbyes.
Hundreds of Hong Kong residents queued for hours in the blistering summer heat to pay their final respects to the Queen Elizabeth II. Over the last 10 days, thousands have visited the British Consulate General to pay their respects and to sign a memorial book. Outside the consulate, piles of flowers, handwritten notes, photographs and mementos had been left by the visitors. After 2 opium wars in the 19th century, Hong Kong became a British colony where colonial rule lasted for 156 years. The Queen served as head of state for 45 years, presiding over a period of last development which some consider to be a golden age of Hong Kong. The territory was returned to Chinese rule in 1997 with a commitment from Beijing that it would respect the one country, two systems arrangement agreed under the deal that ended British colonial rule in the territory. Britain has been especially critical of a national security law imposed in 2020 and electoral changes that says erode the freedoms and autonomy of Hong Kong. And that is all from us from World News Tonight. Now join us again tomorrow for more news around the globe. In case you missed to watch any of the stories we aired tonight, you can always rewatch by catching us on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Derana English. And we leave you tonight with the visuals of the late Majesty's people clamoring to catch a glimpse or pay solemn respect to their beloved Queen who reigned for a peaceful 7 decades. Thank you for joining us. Stay safe and have a good night.